Biblical scholar Dan McClellan released dozens of videos in 2025, and across many of these, the same biblical passages repeatedly form the foundation for his conclusions. And this pattern is especially clear in recent videos on Adonai as Israel's patron deity, Adonai losing to a foreign god, and even Adonai being a liar. And let me be clear, I like Dan, so this is not an attack or an apologetic response. Instead, what I want to do is examine these same texts, introduce additional data, and explore alternative conclusions. And by the way, guys, I'm Brad. I'm a PhD candidate, and on this channel, I explore the fascinating world of mythology as it relates to the biblical text. Now, I'm going to begin with where I agree with Dan, and that is that Adonai was the tribal or patron deity of Israel. However, the framework and the how behind how this came to be, I think, is where Dan and I are going to differ. But we are certainly going to agree that Deuteronomy chapter 32, verses 8 and 9 does affirm that Israel was Adonai's inheritance. Now, Dan states that these verses imply that there was a high deity, the Most High in the passage, or Elyon, that divided up the nations, and that Adonai is one of the B'nai Elohim, or the sons of God, that received a share or received an inheritance, and that his inheritance was Israel. However, there do appear to be several problems with this viewpoint. And firstly is that this event in Deuteronomy 32 recalls back to the Tower of Babel from Genesis chapter 11, and nobody disputes this. And what's interesting to note about this is that the source material for the account of Babel is the J source. And for those familiar with the documentary hypothesis or the JEDP theory, the J source is the earliest source attested to the 10th to 9th centuries BCE. And if we go back to Genesis chapter 10, which lists the table of nations, Israel wasn't a nation that is listed. And so what you have in Genesis chapter 10 is the list of nations. Genesis chapter 11 details how those nations came to be, at least the first 11 or so verses of that. And then it goes into another genealogy. And that genealogy ends with a man named Abram. And in Genesis chapter 12, verses 1 through 9, this is when Adonai calls Abram to raise him up as a nation. And this is a critical point within the book of Genesis, because the book of Genesis is divided into two sections. The first section is going to be Genesis chapters 1 through 11, and the second is Genesis chapters 12 through 50. And this section right here, Genesis 12, 1 through 9, the call of Abram, serves as the hinge point between the primeval history in 1 through 11 and the patriarchal history in 12 through 50. And if we read the first couple of verses from chapter 12, what we find is a set of blessings that Adonai gives Abram. And this is the J source as well. And it states, "Now Adonai said to Abram, go out from your country, your relatives, and your father's household, to the land that I will show you. Then I will make you a great nation, and I will bless you, and I will make your name great, so that you will exemplify divine blessing. I will bless those who bless you, but the one who treats you lightly, I must curse. And all the families of the earth will bless one another by your name." And there's a lot going on here. No doubt that one of the things going on is that Adonai is essentially reversing what happened at the Tower of Babel, where people tried to make their name and elevate their name as great, but Adonai is choosing to do it on his own terms here with Abram. But secondly, and more relevant to our discussion here, is that this is the process of Israel becoming a nation. This is the first step of that. Because for those familiar with the biblical narrative, you have Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Jacob is renamed Israel. He has 12 sons. And so if we're just going off the data from the biblical text, Israel is far from a nation at this point. Secondly, the preceding verses seem to indicate that Adonai and the Most High are the same. And you could make the case that the entire chapter appears this way. And there are numerous references to Adonai by at least 5 different names or titles in verses 3 through 10. These are Adonai, God, Rock, Father, and Creator. And if you read verses 1 through 7, it seems to build Adonai up to a crescendo moment in verses 8 through 9. Now, verse 3 begins by stating, "For I will proclaim the name of Adonai." It then proceeds to describe his greatness and calls him the Rock and a reliable God, a reliable El. And that term El may have some significance for the term Most High in verse 8. And the text then tells of his people's unfaithfulness to him, which, as most know, is a common biblical theme. It then goes on to refer to Adonai as your Father and your Creator, stating that he was the one who made and established you, and this is a reference to Israel. And the text then contrasts the deity language of Father and Creator with the human terminology of Father and Elder in verse 7, when it retrospectively calls the people to ask your Father, and he will inform you, your elders, and they will tell you. And in addition to this, Mark Smith, who is an Old Testament scholar who specializes in Israelite religion as well as late Bronze Age Ugarit, has made the observation that Adonai and El were merged by the 8th century BCE, which means that this fusion had occurred before Deuteronomy was composed, which would beg the question as to what the author of Deuteronomy or the redactor would have in mind to bring that Adonai-El separation back that had been rejected some 200 years prior to this. There's also verses 6 and 7 to consider, which appear to contain numerous El epithets that are attributed to Adonai. So you would have to explain why the redactor of verses 6 and 7 would unite Adonai and El, and then in the following verses 8 and 9, separate them. This would be a horrific blunder on the part of a redactor. And you would also have to contend with Mark Smith's notion that, again, the fusion happened 200 years prior to this. And immediately following, it drops the famous and archaic verses 8 and 9, which begin with, when the Most High gave the nations their inheritance. Additionally, and this is an important point, verse 9, which states, for Adonai's allotment is his people, Jacob his special possession, is a verbless clause. In Hebrew, this 7-word verse consists of 1 conjunction and 6 nouns. In other words, nothing is being given to Adonai, and Adonai is also not receiving anything. In short, there is no action occurring within this verse. And furthermore, verse 10 states that Adonai found him, referring to Israel, in a desolate land. Now, here's the Hebrew word translated found, and as you can see, this is how the verb is translated the majority of the time, which seems to suggest that Adonai did not receive Israel. Additionally, there are archaic and poetic passages within the biblical text, such as Psalm 29, which states that Adonai sits enthroned over the engulfing waters, or the flood. Adonai sits enthroned as eternal king. And the reason this is important is because for those familiar with ancient Near Eastern cosmology, being seated above the flood is over the waters that encircle the earth. In other words, the whole earth. And that's further insinuated by being enthroned as the eternal king. Now, Dan has noted, and this is well known, that poetry is some of the most archaic material within the biblical text. And this is true for Deuteronomy 32 as well. But regarding Psalm 29, some scholars have dated this psalm to the 12th to 10th centuries BCE. And for context, Deuteronomy was composed in the 7th century BCE. Although again, the poetry, such as Deuteronomy 32, is older than the composition date. And there's also 2 Samuel 22 verse 32, which states, for who is God but Adonai? Or who is El but Adonai? And so what all of this seems to suggest is that Adonai was in fact the patron deity of Israel once they became a nation. But prior to the composition of Deuteronomy, Adonai was already viewed as the king over the entire earth, or over the entire land in Hebrew, which would insinuate the whole world. And this, along with the Adonai-El fusion language, he would have therefore been viewed as the Most High. But as I mentioned, Deuteronomy 32 and its relation to Adonai as Israel's patron deity is just one of the 3 themes that I mentioned at the beginning of this video that Dan repeatedly referred to this past year. Another one of these, and as Dan stated, it's one of his favorites, is when Adonai supposedly loses to the patron deity of Moab, Chemosh, in battle. And I'll provide a very short overview. This story seems fairly straightforward, and for that reason, it is very problematic. God promises the Israelites a defeat over the Moabites, even calling this, quote, a light thing in the sight of Adonai. By the way, remember that verse, it's important, and we're coming back to it later. And just when Israel has the final city surrounded, with Mesha, the king of Moab, inside, this Moabite king offers his son and future heir as a burnt offering on the city wall. And then a great wrath falls upon the Israelites, and they withdraw from the city and they return home. And thus, it appears that God's words through the prophet Elisha do not come to pass. Now, a popular explanation for this is that the biblical author is having to navigate a very difficult and problematic event in the career of the prophet Elijah, where Elisha seemingly prophesies wrong, or Adonai simply loses the battle. But in the end, the author seems to admit this, although he appears to greatly downplay the significance of this event. And some have linked what is known as the Mesha inscription, in which the king Mesha, from this story in 2 Kings, credits his patron deity Chemosh with driving the Israelites away. And ultimately, this is what is viewed as the Great Wrath from 2 Kings 3:27. However, there are at least 7 potential reasons that this Great Wrath is actually Adonai placing judgment on Israel, and specifically Israel's king. And these reasons range all the way from the literary structure of the passage to reason number 7, which is an explanation from Dan himself. Now, beginning with the literary structure, we see something very unique within the fulfillment of Elisha's prophecy. And that is that it does not follow the standard prophecy fulfillment pattern, in which a narrator records events in a parallel pattern. Here in 2 Kings, we actually see the narrator reporting the fulfillment of Elisha's words in reverse order, as a chiasm or within chiastic structure. And this reverse order of events sets the reader up for a surprise. And furthermore, in verse 24, which is the verse immediately preceding the fulfillment of the prophecy, the narrator uses the Hebrew word nikah 3 times to describe how the Israelites had attacked, struck, and were destroying Moab. However, in verse 25, the narrator suddenly changes the word from nikah to haras when describing Israel overthrowing. And this change implies that Israel's king Jehoram will not be victorious. But this change is going to be easily missed, especially by readers in English or any language aside from Hebrew. And even in Hebrew, the change is so subtle that the reader might not be picking up on what the author is leading toward. And at this point, the reader is likely under the impression that the author is building up for a word-for-word fulfillment of the prophecy. That is until they are met with a surprise at the very end of verse 25. When the final city seems to almost be taken, it is only the slingers that surround and strike, or nikah, the city. And this is ultimately building toward the idea that Israel and King Jehoram will in fact not be victorious, but rather that the prophecy given to Elisha was intentionally deceptive. And to examine that, we have to go back to 1 Kings chapter 22, where this same type of deceptive prophecy and enticing occurred. And this is the story of King Ahab's defeat. What makes this story relevant to the prophecy of Elisha is that King Ahab's defeat and ultimately death come at the hand of a prophecy from the prophet Micaiah that does not materialize. And to provide additional detail on this, Micaiah is called in to King Ahab. Micaiah tells him in 1 Kings 22 verse 15 that the Lord will give the victory. However, King Ahab is a little skeptical of this and he calls Micaiah out. And Micaiah proceeds to tell Ahab of a divine council throne room scene in which it was decided that Ahab would be enticed to go out to battle in order to lose the battle. And this is what it says starting in verse 20. And the Lord said, "Who will entice Ahab, that he may go up and fall at Ramoth Gilead?" And one said one thing, and another said another. Then a spirit came forward and stood before the Lord, saying, "I will entice him." And the Lord said to him, "By what means?" And he said, "I will go out and will be a lying spirit in the mouth of all his prophets." And he said, "You are to entice him, and you shall succeed. Go out and do so. Now therefore, behold, the Lord has put a lying spirit in the mouth of all these your prophets. The Lord has declared disaster for you." And did you catch the last part of that? While it was a spirit that was to go out and entice the prophets of Ahab, it was the Lord who received credit for the enticing. And it was also the Lord that declared disaster for King Ahab. And this echoes the same framework as the Tower of Babel from Genesis chapter 11, where it stated, "Let us go down," and then it was Adonai alone who received credit for the scattering of the people. And this narrative of a lying spirit from Adonai, or even being the spirit of Adonai, as proof that God lies within the biblical text, I think it's important to make a distinction between lying for evil purposes and being intentionally deceptive because of evil people. Because if you read these narratives, and specifically the one from 1 Kings chapter 22, it was King Ahab's time to go. And this was a direct result of Ahab's wickedness. In fact, twice in 1 Kings, in chapters 16 as well as 21, it describes how evil he was. Chapter 16, verses 29 and 30 mark the beginning of Ahab's rule, and verse 30 summarizes his rule by stating that Ahab, son of Omri, did more evil in the sight of Adonai than all who were before him. And in chapter 21, verse 25, it said, "There had never been anyone like Ahab, who was firmly committed to doing evil in the sight of Adonai, urged on by his wife, Jezebel." And this is an important distinction to make before making claims such as Adonai was a liar and framing it to be because he was somehow some evil deity. But there are other similarities between these passages as well. And these are Elisha's promise of triumph in 2 Kings 3:18 mirrors almost exactly Micaiah's original prophecy of victory in 1 Kings 22:15. And in both stories, Jehoshaphat accompanies a king of Israel into battle. And sticking with Jehoshaphat, in 2 Kings 3, he twice quotes himself from the narrative in 1 Kings chapter 22. And these similarities, along with other textual features, seem to indicate that the enticing and deceptive prophecy in 1 Kings chapter 22 is the reading lens for Elisha's so-called failed prophecy in 2 Kings chapter 3. In other words, just as the prophets of Ahab, inspired by lying spirits, and initially Micaiah, gave an enticing word of victory for Ahab, so Elisha is enticing Jehoram to his defeat by Mesha of Moab. And for readers familiar with Ahab's lineage, these parallels create the expectation of judgment to be passed on King Jehoram. And this is because back in 1 Kings 21:29, Adonai has announced that Elijah's oracle of judgment would come to pass in the days of Ahab's son. And his son is Jehoram. Now, if you remember the verse from earlier in 2 Kings 3:18, where it stated, "This is a light thing in the sight of the Lord. He will also give the Moabites into your hand." This is where that verse comes full circle. And rather than this being one of the most problematic points of this story, in reality, it becomes one of the most compelling clues to indicate that Elisha's prophecy was intentionally deceptive and that Jehoram will not be handed a victory. And that is because the word in which we get the English translation light thing is the Hebrew word kilel. And this word was used one chapter prior, not to describe an easy thing, but to describe a curse on a group of young princes who were heckling Elisha. And if you're not familiar with this story, this is when the prophet Elisha is traveling to Bethel. And on the way, it says a group of small boys came out of the city and began heckling him, although small boys or boys really is not a good translation here at all, and that's why I referred to them as princes earlier. I'll link information in the description below. This group of individuals begins heckling Elijah, saying, go up, Baldy, go up, Baldy. And his response in 2 Kings 2:24 is that he cursed them. He kileled them in the name of the Lord. And 2 she-bears came out of the woods and tore 42 of the boys. Now, these 2 female bears tend to get all the attention in the story because of what they do. However, the link here is that this word kilel is used here to describe a curse. And in chapter 3, it is translated as, this is a light thing in the sight of the Lord. And the linguistic connection here is that chapter 3 is drawing on this curse from chapter 2. And therefore, what we have is more evidence to support the idea that this was not going to be a victory for King Jehoram, but rather, in this instance, he's not only being enticed, it may also be that Elisha is cursing him just as he cursed these 42 individuals in chapter 2. Now, there's another interesting point here that I have seen brought up before from Elisha's speech in which he is speaking on behalf of the Lord, and that is that the Israelites failed because they violated the commands of war outlined in Deuteronomy chapter 20, verses 19 and 20, by chopping down trees that produced fruit. But I think there's a couple issues with this view. First of all, if we go to Deuteronomy chapter 20, what we find is that this is in the law section of wars with Canaanite nations. And specifically, the nations that are listed are the Hittites, the Amorites, the Canaanites, the Perizzites, the Hivites, and the Jebusites. Now, you could make the argument that even though Moab is not listed here, the section before this dealt with war with distant enemies. And if you overlay a map of the tribal distribution of the 12 tribes of Israel with where Moab was located, Moab borders the boundary of the tribe of Reuben in the southeast. Now, given that Moab is not listed, the textual data does not seem to support that. But even if we grant that, the argument that could stem from that is that Adonai here is commanding Israel to do something that he has strictly forbidden them to do within the book of Deuteronomy. And so it's essentially a case of Adonai being mischievous or even deceptive. However, there's another interesting textual note to make here, and that is that at this point in the speech where it states, you must chop down every productive tree, and the NET or the NET translation notes this, and that is that here Elisha places the object first and uses an imperative verb form. The stylistic shift may signal that he is now instructing them what to do, rather than merely predicting what would happen. And this would in fact lend further support to the notion that what we have in the story is Jehoram being enticed. And while this may seem problematic, what it actually does is lend further support to the notion that perhaps Jehoram was enticed to defeat, just like his father. But unlike his father Ahab, he does not die because Adonai is merciful and his retribution is delayed, which is a theme throughout the book of Kings. However, this does not delay Elisha's oracle of judgment, and this comes in time with the death of Jehoram's son in 2 Kings chapter 9. And perhaps the best explanation for this story is not that the biblical authors were trying to cover up Adonai's defeat by Chemosh, but rather that it was Adonai's will that Jehoram would go to battle thinking he would be victorious, only not to receive the victory. And that the great wrath that fell upon Israel in the final verse of this passage was not the great wrath of Chemosh, but rather the great wrath of Adonai. And we see further evidence of this with the noun ketsef, translated as wrath, occurring 28 times within the biblical text, and usually referring to Adonai's wrath or anger, with the exceptions being Ecclesiastes 5:16 and Esther 1:18. And within all 6 occurrences of the word ketsef and gadol, translated as great wrath, used within the biblical text, every single one of these instances refers to the great wrath of Adonai. And therefore, within 2 Kings 3:27, it would make little sense as to why this would be the only instance in which this phrase does not refer to the divine wrath of Adonai. And this is a point that Dan brought up in his video on this topic, and rather than me trying to paraphrase it, here is the clip with his explanation of the passage. And for context here, Dan is talking about why he believes that the prophecy failed.
Failed. Why? Well, it has something to do with this sacrificing of his son and heir on the city wall. The very next words are, great wrath came upon Israel. And the word there, ketsef, for wrath, almost always refers specifically to divine wrath. Now, in the other uses of this term, it's a reference to Adonai's wrath against Israel or against others. But here it doesn't really make any sense why Adonai would suddenly chase off their own force after the king of Moab sacrificed his son on the city wall. There's really only one good explanation for this that does not require we just gin up scenarios that are not in evidence, and that is that the sacrifice worked. It catalyzed the intervention of the Moabite patron deity Chemosh, who then drove off the invading forces and their deity.
Now, this is obviously a point where I disagree with Dan, respectfully so, and one of the goals of this video has been to demonstrate that there are numerous good explanations as to why this divine wrath is the divine wrath of Adonai, with perhaps the strongest and most recent being from the textual data itself, in which the only occurrences of these two words, great wrath, appearing together within the biblical text refer to Adonai's wrath in all other instances. And therefore, it makes sense here in 2 Kings 3 as well. And additionally, this also appears to be a classic two birds with one stone, because Adonai is in fact passing judgment on Israel's king, while at the same time dealing a major blow to Moab, not necessarily within the victories described in battle, but in what we read in the final verse of chapter 3, and that is that the Moabite king Mesha sacrifices his firstborn son that was to succeed him on the throne. But hey, I want to know what you guys think. Let me know in the comments below, and don't forget to like and subscribe, and check out my other videos and playlists on biblical mythology. And you can start by clicking this link right here for a video that YouTube thinks that you're going to like. Thank you all so much for the support, and I will see you in the next video.